Welcome everyone to One Work, Five Questions. And today we have Dr. Holowchak joining us. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, glad to be here. I think I lost my letter. I got to find it. It's okay. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, while I'm doing the introduction, you can look for that. I'm Donna Vitek, and this is Dr. Mark Holowchak. He's a retired professor of philosophy and history who taught at institutions such as University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Rutgers University, Camden, and Ohio University. He's the editor of Journal of Thomas Jefferson and His Time and the author-editor of numerous published books, and close to 150 essays on Thomas Jefferson. So I would say he is the expert. The list of books and his publications will be listed in the video description. With our show, One Work, Five Questions, I'll ask Dr. Holowchak 5 questions on one work of Thomas Jefferson. And where we left off last week, we promised the discussion of Thomas Jefferson's correspondence with an older contemporary, Benjamin Banneker, who was a free Black man and self-taught scientist. Jefferson will indirectly come into contact with Banneker when the former, as Secretary of State, asked surveyor Major Andrew Ellicott to survey the land that will become the District of Columbia. Ellicott, in turn, hires Banneker to assist him. The team parses out a 10-square-mile plot for the district. Banneker's actual contributions to the enterprise are unknown. Banneker, returning home, creates an almanac for 1792. Ellicott, who has been making almanacs since 1780, sends Banneker's almanac to James Pemberton, an abolitionist from Pennsylvania, who sends the almanac to mathematicians and astronomers William Moore and David Rittenhouse, each endorsing the work, which will then get published. Publication makes Banneker an enormous celebrity, and whom many tall tales will be crafted. Just prior to the publication of his almanac, Benjamin Banneker writes to Jefferson a very lengthy letter to bid Jefferson to act on behalf of emancipation, and Jefferson will craft a short, polite reply. Jefferson's short reply is the subject of today's interview. I'm so excited to talk about this.
That was a long introduction, but very well done.
Good background. Yes. It was. Well, it's important to know because we have a lengthy letter from Benjamin Banneker, and then Thomas Jefferson's response is not quite as lengthy, but to me was just as informative. Benjamin Banneker made some good points in his letter to Jefferson, and I really like Thomas Jefferson's response to him. And I want to dive deeper into what Thomas Jefferson's mind and what he meant when he was responding.
Well, we'll try to do that.
Okay.
Fire away.
Okay, I'm Donna Vitek, and this is One Work, Five Questions. Are you ready for question number 1?
I'm always ready.
Always ready. Okay.
My dog's not here today. I don't know what's going on.
Jeffy, the real Jefferson, please bark. Can you tell us first about Banneker's letter to Jefferson? It is not only long, but layered, is it not?
I assume by layered, you mean that just so many different things in it. It is very layered, and it's a letter that's, let me see, it's on August 19, 1791. It's almost 1,400 words. It's a very long letter, and Banneker, we might want to say, he's feeling it, and he's just throwing it out to Thomas Jefferson. He begins with discussion of Black people's plight with the large number of slaves in the 2 continents. He talks about, he has some understanding of Jefferson's pro-abolitionist bent. So he's trying to appeal to Jefferson in that regard. And then he bids Thomas Jefferson to act. He says, let me read here, if these sentiments of which you are fully persuaded, I hope you cannot but acknowledge that it is the indispensable duty of those who maintain for themselves the rights of human nature, like Jefferson does, and who profess the obligations of Christianity to extend their power and influence to the relief of every part of the human race, from whatever burthen is the old version of burden, or oppression they may unjustly labor under. And this I apprehend a full conviction of the truth and obligation of the principle should lead to all. Now, then he goes rather craftily. It's like you said, it's layered. He goes into the columnist's objections to British yoke, the taxation without representation, and the slave had a broad meaning. It meant, in some sense, not just literally what we would call slaves today, but people whose will was not their own. A person working today in a factory and having really no choice, or feeling himself to have no choices, would have been called a slave back then. So then he points to the Declaration of Independence, and he reads Thomas Jefferson's self-evident truths of the equality of all people. Lastly, I'm going to read something for you, and this is where he just dumps on Thomas Jefferson. It's kind of cool. He said, okay, someone who writes the Declaration of the Equality of all people, he said, you should at the same time counteract his mercies, God's mercies, by detaining by fraud and violence so numerous a part of my brethren under groaning captivity and cruel oppression, that you should at the same time be found guilty of that most criminal act which you professedly detested in others with respect to yourselves. Now he says yourselves. He's not, notice a plural here. He doesn't say yourself, which means he's including Thomas Jefferson as a slave owner, as a person who is in advocacy of abolition, but yet doesn't free his own slaves.
Right.
So that's a bit of dumping on old TJ. I mean, it probably did not sit well with him. Okay, and we can probably discuss that later if it has a bearing.
Okay. Yeah. I noticed that he did hold him to some accountability here. You're advocating for abolition, but yet you own slaves. And maybe we can have an episode on why Thomas Jefferson continued to own slaves when he was such an advocate for abolition.
Well, we can talk about today too.
Oh, okay. Okay, yeah. Wonderful. Well, hopefully, let's go through question 2. Maybe we can add that in. So it'll weave into our show today. Question number 2. Okay, now to Thomas Jefferson's letter. He begins his letter to Banneker. Nobody wishes more than I do to see such proofs as you exhibit that nature has given to our Black brethren talents equal to those of the other colors of men. Is he admitting that he may have been wrong about his assessment of Blacks in his notes on the state of Virginia?
Not necessarily. Remember in query 14 of Notes on Virginia, he talks about his suspicion. He uses the word suspicion that Blacks are inferior in intellect, in imagination, things like that, in memory. And, and what people who dump on Jefferson always say is that he's admitting their inferiority, but they don't read it carefully enough. He says, I put these things as merely a suspicion. And he says, we need to do more research on this area. I suspect he thought that those things were true, but he admits openly, candidly there, and in other places, he just doesn't know. We need to study this more. Now he adds, he says the appearance of a want of them in talents, that's what he's reading from the letter, is owing merely to the degraded condition of their existence both in Africa and in America. So he's saying, okay, if you went back to Africa and looked at how Blacks lived there, you wouldn't see anything much different than what you see of them as slaves. And he says there's a degraded condition, and the degraded condition is one of not being civilized, like Europeans and so forth. Now, the intimation here, the suggestion is that it's because of their degraded condition results or leads to diminution of talents. And that's an argument that it's not nature, but nurture. Now, this opens up a whole can of worms starting in Jefferson's day. And my book on Thomas Jefferson and race and slavery, I discussed this in chapter 6, earlier chapters, not chapter 6. Chapter 6 is what Jefferson did. But if it's just nurture, then exposure to the right circumstances over time will ameliorate the situation. And we'll see Blacks behaving as like all other people at the same level. If it's a natural or biological explanation, this opens up a tough can of worms that will get discussed in the generation after Jefferson in the early 1800s.
Okay.
If the different races, if blacks, if Native Americans, if Asians, and so forth, and if whites, all are biologically distinct, and it's not due to geographical separation or circumstances, then does God create, the races at different times? He's created all as human beings of some sort, but is he creating different times, right? So we go from the monogenesis, the one creation in Genesis of the Bible, to polygenesis, that God saw fit to create beings that, and this is something that will get discussed when people are exploring the possibility of biological differences. But Jefferson does somewhere talk of the possibility of biological differences that are created over time by circumstances of nature, right? And notice how we're getting very close to evolutionary biology here.
Well, yeah, well, I can see that, because if you look at different ethnicities, different parts of the world, you do see there are biological differences that are suitable to the environment in which they live. So, I mean, even can you say that people in Ukraine, or there are certain biological features that stand out in personalities.
Ukraine's a terrible example because it's such a hodgepodge of Scandinavic, of Turkish, of Russian, of Polish, all people around there. So, I mean, you want to talk about Ukrainian, but look at Asian Americans or blacks,
right,
or things like that, and Native Americans, and but are we talking about phenotypic or genotypic? Phenotypic just meaning sort of trivial things like, a broader nose or a thinner nose, or curly crinkled hair or straight hair, light complexion, dark complexion. These are sort of phenotypic. We're talking about genotypic differences. We're looking at distinct biological differences, right. Genetic differences that call out for an explanation. So must think today we would explain this all, these are all phenotypic things, and not, no worry about separate creations or something. Of course, we have a evolutionary background here.
Wow. Boy, this letter, it brings up a lot of different, go off in different directions. Question number 3, Thomas Jefferson writes, I can add with truth that no body wishes more ardently to see a good system commenced for raising the condition both of their body and mind to what it ought to be. So often Jefferson is not given credit for attempting to abolish slavery. The criticism is that he said the right things but did nothing. Is that fair?
No, I mean, he did much. And that's where, in chapter 6 of my book, the book to which I was referring, Thomas Jefferson and Race and Slavery, you look at, he has a track record of doing an enormous amount of stuff to try to eradicate slavery in his lifetime, introducing bills and things like that. As a lawyer, he had 6 pro bono cases where he defended Black people who were looking to be freed from the condition of slavery. No one talks about that. Pro bono means didn't ask for any compensation, took it up on his own. So he has a track record early on, prior to his political work, of that. And then, of course, his Constitution for Virginia advocated for elimination of slavery, numerous bills. We talked about the Land Ordinance 1784, talked about the eradication of slavery, and that was voted on, and it was lost by 1 vote. So he has a whole track record just because he's writing. And then notice, as a Southerner, just speaking out against slavery is something you're sticking your neck out. You're basically telling the other Southerners, you're not really much of a Southerner. We all have slaves on the plantation. Now, the other thing to say, I get so tired. I'm reading Thomas Kidd's book on Thomas Jefferson. It's supposed to be he's a religionist, and to me it's a terrible book. It just repeats the same thing about Jefferson's hypocrisy, and doesn't really add a whole lot. And he keeps talking about Jefferson as the white person, and creating these artificial tensions that don't exist. So the question is, why didn't he free his slaves? Why don't people write books on, and this is what I would find interesting, on what happened to these people who were freed? Now we know where they went. The assumption is entirely that the quality of life was just perfect. I'm going to read you a quote I picked for this by Houston Hartsfield Holloway, who writes of being freed just after the Civil War. He says, "For we colored people did not know how to be free, and the white people did not know how to have a free colored person about them." So the assumption is, okay, you're free, you go to the north somewhere, and everything is fantastic. No, things sucked. A
Right.
lot of freed slaves continued to work for their masters with pay instead of leaving. So in other words, they assumed the very conditions in which they lived, right, and just received a salary. Uh, so the whole thing is, what I want to say, there are three reasons that Jefferson, quote unquote, didn't act later in life. One, he was retired. You'll say that's really a bad reason. Could have acted during retirement. The other is, we discussed before, this notion of generational sovereignty. Each generation has its own responsibilities, remember? And,
Right.
and there's something I've published quite a bit on, a Greek word kairos, transliterated Kairos, meaning opportunity or the right time. Doing the right thing at the wrong time is doing the wrong thing.
Right.
Jefferson was abundantly aware, if you push for freedom before people are ready for it, before states are willing to allow for it, you're doing the wrong thing. There could be a civil war. And guess what happens? We had a civil war. I'm not saying it was fought entirely on slavery, because it wasn't, but slavery was part of the reason for it. So doing the right thing at the wrong time is doing the wrong thing. People, Jefferson thought, were not ready for it, and he refused to free any of his slaves if he thought that they could not make it as a white person, did not have specific skills.
That's exactly what I was going to say. From all of our conversations, it sounds to me like he was afraid for them, and actually felt like he was protecting them by keeping him with him.
That's
Because
exactly what he says,
if he
Donna.
said, okay, be free, how would they support themselves? How would they, where would they live? Where would they work? How would they earn a living? And I think
Yeah.
he kept them, I'm not saying all slave owners felt that way, but I do believe that he was very afraid for them, and their safety as well.
Remember, James Hemings bought his freedom. Sally Hemings' brother wound up committing suicide. He was an alcoholic. Jefferson allowed him to buy his freedom, and James committed suicide. And no one talks about that. There's a whole story we can talk about some other time. It's all about Sally Hemings, a relationship that he never had. Well, what about Thomas Jefferson and James Hemings? They were very close. James went with Jefferson to France. We'll talk about that another time. But why did he commit suicide when he was free? Was it hard being a Black person in white culture? Too hard for him. I'll just throw that out.
Wow, that's something to think about. I think you kind of touched on question number 4 in your answer now. Thomas Jefferson shares Banneker's almanac with the Secretary of the Academy of Sciences at Paris, who is also a member of the Philanthropic Society. Jefferson writes, "I consider it as a document to which your whole color had a right for their justification against the doubts which have been entertained of them." Is Jefferson acknowledging the contribution to erase doubts of the intellectual capacity of Blacks?
Um,
You touched on Houston Hartsfield in the last.
Yeah, I mean, Jefferson will say in another letter, whatever the extent of their condition, however degraded it might be, it has no indication of their rights. And he cites Isaac Newton. He thinks very few people have large intellect, even very few whites. There are very few Isaac Newtons, Galileo Galileis, Rene Descartes, and so the average white person, in Virginia is just a simple farmer, right? Just that has a little bit of math and maybe can read and write, conduct his affairs. Jefferson is hoping for that. And, so what's the thing here? I mean, he is hopeful that his views on Blacks are wrong. He doesn't know. Time will tell. Right. But he's also cautious about freeing people that are not ready to be free. There could be a lot of danger there.
Well, and I think what Benjamin Banneker wrote in his letter to Thomas Jefferson, I highlighted it, and I think that speaks highly of, it gives us some indication of who Thomas Jefferson really was. In the third paragraph, he says that you are measurably friendly and well disposed toward us, and that you are willing and ready to lend your aid and assistance to our relief from those many distresses and numerous calamities to which we are reduced. So that to me says a lot about
He's
the
hoping, but
respect.
then remember, as I said before, he also dumps on Jefferson and other
Right,
people for being slave owners who don't free their slaves.
right,
I'm just trying to say you just can't assume, this magic wand we have today. Okay, George Washington freed his slaves. Kid says George Washington freed his slaves. Why didn't Jefferson? Well, just don't assume that when someone's freed, they're jumping into a much better condition. You
right,
could drown like James Hemings did. We
right,
don't know that it's going to be better.
right.
Of course, being able to lead your own life, make your own decisions. But if you're put in a position where you can't make your own decisions, even though theoretically you're free, you're really not free.
Right. And I think Jefferson's plan for the expansion west and for disbursement, and that was a safe way for the slaves to start working towards freedom and building a life for themselves. So he did do a lot more than we give him credit.
He did a
Okay,
lot.
question 5. No. Um, there is, as you have told me, more to the story. There's even more than what we've discussed. Can you tell me more?
Yeah, there are two more letters. Now,
Okay.
immediately after this exchange with Banneker, Jefferson writes the Marquis de Condorcet, and he talks about, in glowing terms, he talks about Banneker. And this is on August 30, 1791. He said, it talks about, Benjamin Banneker's mathematical, geometrical talents and things like that. Talks about being a free man. Then he writes, I shall be delighted to see these instances of moral eminence so multiplied as to prove that the want of talents observed in them, in the blacks, is merely the effect of their degraded condition and not proceeding from any difference in the structure of the parts on which intellect depends. So again, he's saying he's very hopeful that Banneker is an instance of someone showing that, if put into the right environment, Black people
Mm-hmm.
will excel just as any other people will. And
Mm-hmm.
then lastly, he writes, and this is where, we get a monkey wrench here. He writes to Joel Barlow on October 8, 1809,
Mm-hmm.
and he writes concerning Bishop Gregoire, who does everything he can to amass all sorts of instances of Black people showing genius meaning high intelligence, and Jefferson writes, he says, the whole do not amount in point of evidence to what we know ourselves of Banneker. We know he had spherical trigonometry enough to make almanacs, but not without the suspicion. Notice he says the suspicion of aid from Ellicott, who was his neighbor and friend and never missed an opportunity of puffing him. He says, I have a long letter from Banneker, which shows him to have had a mind of very common stature indeed. And we have reason to question that because I think the letter shows, Banneker was a very sharp man. As to
Right.
Bishop Gregoire, I wrote him, as you have done, a very soft answer. It was impossible for doubt to have been more tenderly or hesitatingly expressed than that was in Notes on Virginia. Notice talks about his doubt. And nothing was or is farther from my intentions than to enlist myself as the champion of a fixed opinion where I've only expressed a doubt, right? So what he's saying here,
Yeah.
whatever I've said about Blacks in Notes on Virginia, it's not a fixed opinion. Time
Right.
will tell whether I'm right or wrong. This is why I
Right.
always say in my writings, were Jefferson alive today, he would have changed his mind. There would have been
Yes.
ample evidence for him to change his mind. So you can't, like Peter Onoff, who was the Thomas Jefferson professor at UVA, writes in one of his books about a young Black person in his seminar at Jefferson saying, I have a real hard time being here knowing Jefferson wouldn't have wanted me here. Now, Onoff shoved that kind of garbage down their throats. Jefferson would have been happy to have Black people at the University of Virginia where he alive today. Right?
Right.
He didn't think that they were capable of it. Probably thought that in his day. Some could have. But again, most white people weren't capable of an education at University of Virginia in his day. So he would have had a change of mind. And that's all I say. keep an open mind and keep the discussion in the past, of the past, in the past, by using
Right.
what we know of what they knew.
Right. Right.
We never do that.
So important to not apply today's.
Well, that's my last. Do you have any concluding thoughts? What did you like? What did you not like? And what do you?
I really, I thought that Thomas Jefferson, at first, I was a little taken aback because his response was very short, considering the lengthy letter Benjamin Banneker and the things that the points that Benjamin Banneker made to him. But I liked how Thomas Jefferson took responsibility for his previous thoughts on blacks and did open the door to being wrong. So that was very humbling, I thought.
This is part of being an empiricist. You know, you let, what's what historians don't do today. Let the facts generate your conclusions. Don't start with your conclusions and pick out facts. So Jefferson was always, you know, he goes, yeah, the evidence at my disposal shows me so far that blacks probably are inferior, say, in intelligence. Let them be the subject, he says in the notes on Virginia Query 14, of further investigation. I may be proven wrong. People always conveniently never mention that. They never mention that.
Right.
So he was empiricism, which is a philosophical position, which means you let the evidence frame your conclusion, is seen by other people. He's confused.
Right.
Well, I think it's the people who write on Jefferson today that are confused. They just, you know, it's the politically correct, progressive crap that we have to dump on anybody who lived 200 years ago.
Yeah, they're cherry picking and that's why I enjoy our conversations, because you have studied all of the work of Thomas Jefferson thoroughly. You haven't just read and picked out parts that suit the narrative for today. You have
to put yourself back. You have to pretend you're in that climate. How would I have acted otherwise than Jefferson? I don't think I would have. I think I understand his position.
Well, that's the point I actually made in one of my discussion board questions in my last class.
Oh,
none of us can say how we would have acted back then, because we didn't have the pressures back then. Today,
and lack of information.
We live in a world of plenty. More so than they had back then. So there was a very, I can't imagine living feeling that there's such a scarcity that you have to dislike other people because you feel threatened that there's not going to be enough for you because now they're taking from you. So who knows how we would have behaved? I can't say how I would have behaved back then. I know how I am now because of the life I've lived in, the world I've lived in for now. But put us in an apocalyptic.
And future generations might laugh at us for the things we're articulating today, the things in which we believe, you know. So.
Yeah. And, put us in an apocalyptic situation and there becomes scarcity. We see it all the time here in Florida when we have hurricanes and people are trying to get water and stock up for hurricanes. There's no politeness anymore. So we're almost out of time. Let me go to our closing thoughts. Dr. Holowchak, will you give us a teaser on what we have to look forward to next week?
Okay, so it's my call next time. I don't have anything overly exciting, but if you're interested in Jefferson's political philosophy, yeah, you'll love next time. But when he's in Paris, members of the Continental Congress, remember, we don't have a constitution. We have the Articles of Confederation not working all too well. So members of the Continental Congress get together, start working on a constitution for the United States. And Jefferson, in many letters, once he gets a copy of the proposed Constitution, especially in exchanges with James Madison, and that's what we're going to look at next time, a 1787 letter with James Madison discusses what he claims are, he tells Madison what he likes and he doesn't like. So many things he likes about the Constitution, and two things especially he doesn't like. So he makes the puzzling claim, I'd like to see 9 states, vote to ratify and 4 states vote against ratification. Well, 9, is 2/3 roughly. 9 is what it would take to get the Constitution passed. 4 is what it would take, in 4 states shows, in his words, shows in some sense that there are some things he didn't like about the Constitution. So what is it that he didn't like about the Constitution?
Oh.
Why did he want to see it just barely ratified, but also see some opposition to it?
Okay. Oh, I can't wait to learn about what Thomas Jefferson did not like about the Constitution. Wow, that's going to be interesting. I can tell you something that I just recently learned that I don't like about the Constitution. I think it's in the Fifth Amendment, eminent domain, that protects that the government can take your property and turn it into for public use, but they must give you fair value. Well, who determines what the fair value of your property is? The government, or do you get to tell them what the fair value is? So that's something that
Well, they did that in 1932, 1933 in Ukraine. The Russian government, the Soviet Union took over people's farms and houses and forced the genocide. I'm working on that in my new book on Ukraine. But yeah.
Yeah, so
and we'll get to talk about Jefferson's views of constitutions as well, slide into that. And Jefferson, like some people today, and now let's dump on the conservatives a little. A lot of conservatives always want to claim the Constitution is the sacred doctrine, and whatever it says, we have to hold it up like it's the holy of holies. And Jefferson, no, it needs, the Constitution needs to be taken with a grain of salt. It's not a holy doctrine, but it's supposed to represent the general consensus of what people think at a given time. And when that consensus shifts, it needs to be changed.
Right, and that's why we have the process of amending the Constitution and to make amendments, and so that's important that we have order, some sort of order.
And then the other thing to think about too is a lot of people today will say, this amendment shows that, and you have to understand, or when a principle was articulated at the time of the Constitutional Convention, what did they mean by it? We have to take it within the context of when it was framed. Does it apply in the same way to us today? Some cases yes, some cases no.
All right, right.
Okay, that's
this is going to be an